What I try to do today is building on research I've been doing since the, well, about 10 years now, around the Mediterranean migration crisis and the construction of the crisis. I'm going to look in particular to some aspect related to the way that key politicians in Europe discussed and acknowledged migrant deaths, and the role of this sort of public expression of mourning had in the change in the European policy responses to migration from the Mediterranean, through the Mediterranean. Linking up to something that was mentioned yesterday, we often refer to the refugee crisis, the migration crisis as a 2015-16. And so I put that photo from 2008, and this is the boat cemetery in Capo Passero, Sicily, just to give you a sense of how, even when we talk about the refugee crisis in inverted commas, the temporalities of the crisis really has got different trajectories. And if you look at European level, national country level, but also a local level. So, but it's not the topic of the presentation today. Anyway. So the kind of question I'd like to sort of reflect on is around the way that have the migrant death impacted on the production of the EU migration crisis, and now, in what ways the visibility of dead bodies has shaped the responses and vice versa, and finally, who does mourn and claim whom, which is a sort of set of kind of question. Who are the people that are basically expressing sympathies and their condolences, and which groups receive or are the target of these condolences? It's quite an important aspect to understand the development of what we have witnessed since the mid-2010s. The way I'm going to proceed is just to give you very sort of basic sort of facts in inverted commas around the 2015-16 refugee crisis, 13 to 16 refugee crisis, a few sort of conceptual underpinning for the argument, and then we look at some examples of how key politicians in Europe responded to three events in particular, in which there were a large number of migrants that died in the crossing, while crossing the Mediterranean. And finally, and I will use this example to highlight a way, in which way, and yes, this was mentioned already yesterday, in a sense, the ambivalence which is embedded in European responses to the death at sea, the humanitarian narrative, which has also a control dimension to it, and try to see how within this public statements you can read some of the underpinning logic of the responses, European, both at European level and national level to the arrival. Let's see. So in terms of, just as a reminder, to between 2014 and 16, it was about 1.6 million people crossed the Mediterranean. In 2015 alone, about 845,000 people traveled to Greece from Turkey, while 153,000 crossed mostly from Libya to Italy. Over this period, the period of 2015, there were about 3,771 people that were either dead or missing over the period of time. Just again to slightly destabilize the notion of crisis, I wanted to share sort of this graph in which you can see the arrival, how they went. So the cyclicity of the arrival is, particularly if you look from the perspective of the central Mediterranean route, is particularly interesting. However, it's also relevant to see how the peak in terms of arrival in Greece is also very, so to much more time confined, let's say. So what happened as a result of this arrival, this stage? There was a significant transformation of the governance of migration in the Mediterranean. We saw, for example, the significant expansion of the role of Frontex. There was the creation of the network of the hotspots, as particularly in the southern Mediterranean border. There was the launch of the attempt to a redistribution scheme, which migrants or asylum seekers were in theory being moved in other European member states, although not worked very much. The crisis also played a significant role in anti-migrant politics, both European and international level. This is the time in which you have people like Donald Trump, Salvini, you have Brexit, all political sort of figures that used the refugee crisis as a way of mobilizing political support. So the refugee crisis became also, has got several life in the political life of Europe and internationally as well. And we also saw, in terms of the transformation of the global governance of migration, this is the period in which there was the launch of the global compact on refugees. There was a global compact on migration, which are soft law instruments, as well as a debate around the definition of who is a migrant or refugees became much more central in the governance mechanism. There was all this debate about how these migrants, the mixed motivation, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a period that very much the crisis, and I mentioned inverted comma because it's, as I said, produced, but also in itself produced significant transformation in the governance of migration and more broadly. How, at what extent the migrant death played a role in this process is what I'm trying to look at in this presentation. Everyone here would be familiar with the work of Judith Butler that's pointed out at the way in which those who we mourn or we don't mourn, in a sense, redefine the border of humanities, but also creates, in a sense, a claim of community. And this work has got clearly a political underpinning, as Ida then would point out, that there is not only about the definition of humanity, but in a sense, specific groups, or the decision about who to mourn also enables specific political projects, forms of politics to emerge, while sometimes obfuscating others. And the three moments that I found played a significant role in this development, and I'll try to link up the specific events, tragedies, to shift in the governance of migration that occurred in Europe at the time, are in particular the Lampedusa shipwreck of October 2013, the several tragedies that occurred within the space of a week, in which about 1,200 people died in April 2015, and finally the death of Alan Kurdi in August 2015. This moment became and initiated in the political and policy debate with Europe a significant shift in the approach. So if you look at, in particular, at the Lampedusa shipwreck of 2013, and apologies for the fonts, there was a problem with the movement between versions. They became the reason, or in the sense, the push for a shift in the approach to search and rescue operation. There was the launch of the so-called Mare Nostrum operation that led within 12 months to the rescue of about 153,000 people. Following the April 2015 tragedies, we saw a transformation again of the search and rescue approach, but also broader transformation in terms of the resources allocated to the governance of the mobility within the Mediterranean. So what was the period in which we had the launch of what is called Triton Plus approach, which was a Frontex EU-led operation with an hybrid mandate. And finally, everyone will remember the public and political responses to the death of Alan Kurdi. This is the last photos of him alive, so rather than use that was circulated in the media, and in which basically led to Angela Merkel and Germany adopting an open door policy. In the month following the Alan Kurdi death, in 1 month alone, we had about 200,000 people crossing into Greece from Turkey. So what I'm going to do next is to look at some of the statements that were issued following these three tragedies. So first, I start with this is the only one in Italian. The other one I'll translate. I'll translate myself. So this is Gianni Letta, Enrico Letta, the then Italian Prime Minister of Italy, who was a non-elected Prime Minister. This is a very important thing because he is a very strong Catholic ethos. The event in Lampedusa occurred just a few weeks after a few months after the appointment. I don't know if for a Pope, do you say appointment? But the appointment of Pope Française, who has always had a very strong position in relation to the migrants, and actually Lampedusa was his first international trip, and which he basically called the event a disgrace. So you can see how, and this is linked to the politics of migration I mentioned before about Trump and Salvini, how the non-elected dimension play a role, but it's not essentially. So what Gianni Letta says here is acknowledging the significance of the event, saying that Italy would make of immigration a central issue in national political agenda, but also at European level. And when Italy is going to take the position as leading the European Council, which was actually happening soon after, it will make this at the center of the European agenda itself, and get, this is interesting, the European Commission involved. Okay, one of the elements which we can follow through in during the period of the refugee crisis is the shift and the tension between national, European and global level of governance. Who is involved? Who claims the life of the people that deaf? Who is using those life and those dead bodies in order to legitimize a shift in the power relations and the governance of migration? So what we see here is that Italy, from the beginning, is trying to get the European Commission involved. It's interesting that if we look at other key politicians at the time, the emphasis was much more on the role of the European Council, which, if you're familiar with the architecture of European institutions, European Council is where the Prime Minister meet together. So it actually is the place where Prime Minister decides things, while the European Commission is meant to be the communitarian level of decision making. So it's a quite significant difference. The then French President Hollande, responding to, on the 25th of October, to the tragedy of Lampedusa, instead he pointed out that it's a human tragedy, which isn't the first and unfortunately isn't the last. Even today, reports are reaching us and arousing strong feelings and solidarity. These are legitimate with regard to the disaster and to this human situation. But they also raise a question: won't there be an influx of refugees in the coming weeks and months? Okay. So while there is an acknowledgement, interesting in the statement, of the significance of the sentiment and the solidarity which is triggered by the event, there is actually very interesting immediately a border control agenda coming up, in which he shows a concern for the arrival not of irregular migrants, but it's concern of arrival of refugees, which is quite an interesting sort of in terms of the language, which we have seen through over this period. And he come up with a 3-point agenda in following up to the statement, the same statement, basically deciding that they're going to target the countries of origin and transit, that we're going to increase the power of the border checks and monitoring of borders through the role, for example, of Frontex and Eurosur, and then, and this is interesting, combating traffickers and trafficking. When you look at the way that I've been looking at this statement, apart, I was very interested to see how do they identify the victims? Who are these victims? Are they refugees, irregular migrants? What's the problem with that leads to this migration? But also, what's the solution? Is actually a way of reading this statement. It's clear here that is identifying as a main issue of that is affecting these refugees, because it's used before, the role of traffickers. As we receive with the next statement from Matteo Renzi, written in an editorial for the New York Times in April 2015, 2 years later, it's very important to observe also which group deserve, in a sense, our emotional response. So what Matteo Renzi says in 2015, after the 1,200 people had died in 1 week alone, the Mediterranean Sea, cradle of our civilization, is becoming a deathbed for thousands of nameless, desperate men, women, and children. These people had lives full of pain, despair, and hope, which led them to become victims of human trafficking. The voices of mothers lost their children at sea will haunt our conscience. We must stop this carnage. Why I found this very interesting? Because while there is a call for intervene, we need to stop this carnage. What we want to pay attention to here is why we need to stop the carnage. Where is the moral obligation come from? What the foundation was a moral obligation. And one interesting first is the claim of the territory. No, this is the cradle of our civilization. Things are happening in the Mediterranean is ours, and so we have a responsibility to intervene first. Who is responsible for this is the human trafficking and is human trafficker. In fact, we all remember that one of the first things that was actually launched after was the war on traffickers, has been at the core. And with the very interesting, in the case of Renzi, the use of traffickers rather than smugglers, all through his actually speech in English, which, as he's got quite good political advisor, is not by chance, I would say. And finally, which is also interesting, is the place where this death occurred, which is actually really important, at sea. Why does it matter? Because as we will see later, a lot of the strategy that get implemented in response to the death is all based about not having more people dying at sea. And we know that they are still dying, but certainly not at the same level that in this period. It doesn't matter if people die elsewhere. I mean, this is quite an interesting way of positioning the narratively the statements. Other politicians express their sympathies and their solidarity and their condolences. However, what they do, and this is really interesting, they use again this expression of condolences also for positioning themselves in relation to where they see the role of their own country. One thing that really interested me is, and as if you have followed the development of the responses by the discussion between different countries, it is quite telling here, where David Cameron says that yes, search and rescue operations are really important, but that's not the solution. Actually, one of the key aspects of the British position, especially at the beginning, was the search and rescue operation were actually causing the increase in the number of people crossing. And there has been also an issue that was discussed in Parliament around this. But the other thing which is also interesting is that while Italy was pushing for the involvement of the European Commission and was actually saying this is a tragedy which is not Italian but is European, the British are saying, yes, it's a European tragedy and we will help you, but because we are not European. In a sense, it's also in projecting this solidarity, is also distancing themselves. We saw how we end up after that. You know, there is Brexit coming the following year, and so we are not surprised by that position. And again, the final moment that really triggered the response, we saw the change in policy following Alan Kurdi death, the open door policy that Germany. I'm sorry, Allah, for this is not all on screen. What is interesting here, and I have also the statement from the other prime minister I can refer to in a second. It's this reference that Britain will act with its head and heart, providing refuge for those in need while working on a long-term solution to the crisis. Again, he's sort of saying that we cannot only rely on the search and rescue operation, but it's also in a way of through the public statements of grief to establish a confirmed national and geopolitical interest. There is very much the idea that the death of migrants become a way of legitimizes political and military intervention in areas of crisis. And this is really interesting because we have seen also more recently the fact that there is so many refugees become a way to say the refugees are coming here, we need to do something, we can intervene, that legitimize our position to save the refugees from having to leave their country of origin. So this dimension of the macro politics linked to the movements, I think is something to keep an eye on in the way on understanding the development of the European responses to the refugee crisis in that comment. The second quote is from Angela Merkel. As we know, no, actually there is another one from actually the other point from David Cameron is that the role that he is going to help by taking people from refugee camps. So even in the middle of a major crisis and with thousands of people dying, it was still, as we have seen recently, if you want to link up what's happening with Ukrainian refugees, this very firm position by the British government that we don't want people to come directly here. We only take people that have already been recognized as refugees and we transfer them in the country. So as an approach to asylum. Because we want to save them from doing a hazardous journey. So again, you can see this, if you construct the danger associated with the sea, the death of migrants, only in relation to the Mediterranean water, this will become, as you can see here, a way of legitimizing the fact that we can stop there on land. And this is partly why with other work we have done as part of the work with Evan Crowley and Frank Duell and Simon McMahon. It was also to highlight in an article that came out recently with in International Migration Review, is the extent to which experience of violence and death were actually very much common in the experience of the people that actually made the journey. So understanding how people face the risk of the sea, you can only understand if you understand what's the risk before the sea in many ways. And it's something that in European responses, in the political response, is something that wants clearly obfuscate. And this is the point about, you know, the politics of visibility and invisibilization of that is really important to bear in mind. And Angela Merkel instead, the emphasis of the response is more on the right. Now we need more Europe, the more Europe approach. So it's Germany open its door, but it's part of this process of Europeanization of asylum and dealing with the arrival. So in many ways, what we see is that the responses that we have seen before very much become a way of justify the policy transformation is almost a response to the tragedies. So the policy follow the tragedy. 2 minutes. Okay. Yeah. Wow. No, that's fine. But however, it's also really important to look at the other way around. And this was mentioned yesterday in the discussion. To what extent, in many ways, we never not forget the fact that you can also read the same policy changes as the death as caused by European border policy. And you can basically look at different, if you use different chronology, you would read a different story. So for example, in the transition between Mare Nostrum to Triton, not Triton Plus, you can see the mortality rate in the Mediterranean went up significantly. How do you see that? This is the fantastic work that forensic architecture has been doing for years, has been documented, is the fact that the rescue operation areas got much more restricted and was not covering, this is very briefly, the areas where the accidents were occurring. But also, if you can see the other one, this is from both major from a report from MSF, was the different kind of infrastructure available. The rescue, the number of boats in the sea was significantly reduced. So the shift in policy produced death, you could argue as well. So how do we can, so what I try to do is to try linking up towards also Maurice Steele has been writing a few years back. It's this idea that these official forms of commemoration, like through the public statement by the politician, not necessarily they become practice employed by the state that EU leaders do not transform or unsettle understanding of citizenship and community. They create a humanitarian exception and disconnect the death from the violent politics of EU border regime. So this idea is that in many ways, and this has also been presented through the concept of the border spectacle as a schizophrenic. I think more than schizophrenic, actually, the point is to demonstrate how the ambivalence is produced within these policies, how the humanitarian narratives that we saw in those statements become an enabler of a border control policy or the immigration control, which is done elsewhere from the sea. So as we could see, for example, and I'll close, what we've seen here, the last two things. Oh, sorry. Here it is. So what we see is that basically the way that the European Union responds in relation to death has followed these three sort of kind of answer. One is the absence, so the saving humans at sea. We want them to disappear. The way of is use the migrant bodies, making them distant, so pushing the externalization policy so they don't die in the area which we feel as our responsibility. If people dies in Libya or like around the way, it's not our problem, in inverted commas. And finally, also with the idea of the invisibilization of the body, we have seen, for example, the crime of solidarities. We have seen access to migration routes and infrastructure being restricted. We have seen the fact that how NGOs have been pushed out of the sea or they have struggled compared to the beginning. So the visibilization of the bodies. In conclusion, so the EU politics of mourning, one element is, but the EU politics of mourning is anchored to the parcel of the Mediterranean Sea. And this anchoring plays a very significant role in terms of enabling migrant dead bodies to be weaponized to achieve immigration control and border closure against living migrants who are immobilized on land with attempt to integrate them, for example, in the labor market in routes. This is all the global compact agenda, which I'm bypassing that. The creation of condition of like the one we've seen debated, the slave market in Libya, in a sense, is the top of an iceberg, which is linked to the process of commodification of migrant bodies, which has been, and the use of migrant bodies as bargaining chip, both for profit, but also for geopolitical reasons. We have seen now, for example, the use of the migrants issues as a way to exert influence on a lot of countries en route to Europe, even if the people were not en route. And finding the public expression of grief have gradually dried up. And this is actually a question. What we notice, and I know that has been pointed out, that nowadays people are still dying in the sea. No one is issuing any more statements. We don't really have a prime minister writing about it. And what I'm wondering about is, what does it mean in terms of the migration governance? And this is, I think, is an open question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nando. Sorry about I've been a very bad chair, but I was so absorbed by your presentation, I forgot the time. So Diana, next. Right. So Diana Volpe, you are a district candidate at the Oxford Department for International Development, and you're going to present part of your research. And so this time we shift from the policy narratives to more NGOs and activist narratives.
Thank you very much. Coming after Nando is actually perfect because I feel like I pick up exactly where he left off. Yeah, I'm presenting part of the work that I did in my master's research. Just get right in. So just to give you a bit of a structure of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you a little bit of context without going too much in depth because we've just done that. And also, I'm sure that all of you are very aware of what's happening in the Mediterranean anyway. Give you a little idea of how I went about this research. And then looking at the four main themes that I found in it and discussing it more generally. So I will start off with some of the context that is relevant, but yeah, without going too much in depth. So as most of you know, Italy's original search and rescue operation that was launched in 2013 was called Mare Nostrum. And as Nando was just talking about, the name itself is quite political and it's imaginary because it takes in a way cultural ownerships of the Mediterranean Sea as a whole, an imaginary that utilizes the name that was given to it by the Roman Empire. So it's something that goes quite deep into Italian culture. And also just was reused afterwards by nationalist movements in the country, such as like the fascist movements after unification, and gives it a very particular understanding of where legitimacy of geographical spread reaches in Italy at the time. So the operation was stopped after 1 year, citing excessive financial burdens that it put on the Italian government, and NGOs filled in to fill that gap. So yeah, after that, Italy became the epicenter of a lot of debates around what was happening and the links, the presumed links between smugglers and NGOs at sea. And this became very obvious also in the way it was talked about in Italy, the introduction of things such as the Codice Miniti, which was a code of conduct that was asked for NGOs to sign. My research in particular focuses on the subsequent period after the end of Mare Nostrum, which is the period that has been called by forensic oceanography as Mare Clausum, which was an undeclared operation of containment through multi-level policy between Italy, the Libyan Coast Guard, and the EU. I was most interested in understanding how these circumstances, under circumstances, actors that were engaged at sea were both understanding their legitimacy and their positionality, as well as navigating the dynamics that contributed to the ideological formation of the border. So for this reason, it might be worth just having a very quick overview of the history of Italy-Libya relations. This is by no way exhaustive. So without going into much detail, especially of the brutal years of colonization of the 20th century that precede this, just a few of the agreements on migration control that go back into the 2000s with cooperation agreements signed as far back as 2004 between Berlusconi and Gaddafi, and being followed by the much more famous Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation of 2008, which was nominally about colonial reparations, but really included articles on cooperation and migration, which formed the basis of further technical and financial assistance, also including like the so-called Libyan Coast Guard. So the latest agreement, as far as my research goes, was a memorandum of understanding. So something that was just at executive level on development cooperation, illegal migration, human trafficking, fuel smuggling, and reinforcement of border security. So in this context, the humanitarian mission of saving lives has become increasingly interlinked with securitization of incoming migration through the Mediterranean. So my research analyzed the following question: how do relevant actors in the Mediterranean navigate between frameworks of humanitarianism and securitization to legitimize their own actions? Once again, without going into too much detail, I broadly speak to the literature on securitization as a discursive process, and more specifically, the intersection between humanitarianism, security, and the security humanitarian nexus in border spaces, such as the Mediterranean. And in particular, I am contributing to this area by presenting an analysis of these framings in contrast with each other. So to do this, I've used critical discourse analysis to analyze media and government resources. I have focused on the period of 2016-2017, so following what we've just talked about, for a number of reasons. So first of all, because it's the period of the Mare Clausum operation that I just talked about. Secondly, because the 2017 Memorandum of Understanding divides this time frame into roughly 2 sections of before and after, which allows us to see if any like narrative shift had happened in the time. And then thirdly, it englobes events that are discussed in current ongoing legal cases, such as the SS and others versus Italy, which included interactions between Sea-Watch and the Libyan Coast Guard. I've collected data from NGOs and government press releases, as well as 5 different newspapers across the Italian political spectrum to the best that I could. Overall, it included about 3,000 results, out of which I coded about 130 relevant articles that I then found through 4 main themes, which you can find in this overview here. So a theme of evocative imagery, which goes both ways in like fear mongering and humanity bringing, a use of international law, obviously the idea of security and securitization, and the idea of humanity. So not all of them use all of these themes in equal ways, but there's a lot of overlap in the way these are used by actors at sea. So to start with employment of the law. When I talk about employment of the law, I'm talking about the selective employment of legal frameworks and obligations to justify oneself and criticize the other. So in the case of the state, what this means is taking a very narrow understanding of international legal obligations, in this case to focus on anti-trafficking and anti-smuggling conventions, as we just talked about, for example, in focusing on things like the Palermo Protocol. Here I present 2 quotes. One is from Luigi Di Maio, who was the time head of the 5-Star Movement, who says, "Who pays for these Mediterranean taxis? Why do they do it? We will submit a question in Parliament and we will get to the bottom of the story." The second quote is from Carmelo Zuccaro, who was chief prosecutor of Catania at the time, which says, "Human traffickers directly call NGO vessels. In my opinion, some NGOs could be financed by traffickers, and I know of contacts. This form of trafficking today is as profitable as drugs." So these obviously are just 2 exemplary quotes of the kinds of things that I've mentioned in this theme. But the main 3 themes in this area are the pull factor narrative, which was also just mentioned, the idea that NGOs are first of all making more people get on boats at sea by the fact that they are there to rescue them, but also the idea that NGOs are colluding with smugglers for their own profit, and overall just making the crossing more dangerous for migrants. In digging into this narrative, I found out that, well, it was started in a Financial Times publication in December of 2016. No, yeah, 2016. And it was based on confidential Frontex reports, which accused NGOs of smuggling or colluding with smugglers. The Financial Times subsequently retracted the statement, admitting to overstating their accusations, but Frontex continued to consolidate them, and they got picked up by national media, especially Italian national media, quite a lot, as we can see from the quote above from Carmelo Zuccaro in particular. Carmelo Zuccaro's accusations were also entirely based on these reports, according to which NGOs would start search and rescue operations before any distress calls were actually sent to the rescue centers in Rome. Another image often heard and used by alt-right movements in Italy, and before looking into this once again, I thought they belonged to them, was the idea of sea taxis, NGOs as just like sea taxis to bring people over. But the first time it was actually used, it was by Luigi Di Maio, which is not part of an alt-right movement. It's a much more like catch-all populist figure in Italy, which ties directly into the third theme, that of criminalization of NGOs, the idea that they are smuggling people, they are going against international law. So how do NGOs justify their work and respond to these kinds of narratives and accusations? They respond in a wide, in a lot of different ways. There's no real like NGO answer to these kinds of things. It depends a lot on the NGO itself, the kind of culture that the NGO has and how it's used to dealing with the governments. But on a broad spectrum, what they do is they repeat that they save lives at sea and that saving lives at sea is not a crime. They are following maritime law, and illegal actions are happening at sea, but these are under the responsibility of Italy and the European Union, such as the pushbacks done by the EU-financed Libyan Coast Guard. So they differ widely in their response. Here I put once again a couple of quotes. Sea-Watch famously takes the most antagonistic stance against Italy in these contexts, as the quote shows. They make threats of taking legal steps against the state for defamation campaigns. This one in particular was as a response to the Zuccaro quote that I put earlier. Other NGOs such as Médecins Sans Frontières focuses on highlighting what is left unsaid by the governments in their discourses, such as the omission of all of the cross-Mediterranean agreements and Frontex operations at sea, calling it a great exercise of hypocrisy by European governments. SOS Méditerranée, the other quote on the slide, also emphasizes that NGOs are not the only actors present at sea, mentioning that there's other vessels, merchant navy vessels, the Italian Coast Guard, the Frontex vessels. So there's a lot of actors and a lot of different dynamics happening in that space. MOAS, for example, is an NGO working at sea that always remain relatively pragmatic, taking quite defensive stances in these accusations, just emphasizing that their conduct always falls within the rules of the sea. These kinds of relations were very obvious also in the way that people reacted to the code of conduct that Italy asked NGOs to sign. This code required them commitment to, among other things, like not enter Libyan search and rescue zones, not impede rescues in act by the Libyan Coast Guard, and most controversially, allowing Italian armed police officers on their NGO boats. Most of NGOs refused to sign it, which in turn didn't technically allow them to bring migrants or just like stop in Italian ports anymore. But some did, such as MOAS and Save the Children, justifying this as a pragmatic stance in order to continue being able to save lives at sea. The Invocation of Security, as we're all very aware, is a discursive strategy mostly employed by the state. So the narrow focus taken by governments in the context of the Mediterranean crisis is often solely concentrated on combating, as the quote shows, criminal organizations against one of the most heinous crimes, such as trafficking of human beings, which for huge economic profits go as far as segregating and torturing migrants. This kind of narrative choice of words just obfuscates the involvement of the EU in running, for example, financing the detention institutions in the Libyan shore that are actually the site for a lot of the torturing and the human rights abuses that are condemned by the European government. The idea of NGOs as death merchants and enemies and cooperators. But also something that comes up a lot is this kind of ambivalent stance with Libya as a whole, because they simultaneously recognize Libya as an unstable environment, as an unstable state, as a place that needs continued cooperation from the Italian government in order to keep it stable and stabilized, while at the same time considering it a safe third country of return. And another main theme that is used a lot is the kinds of evocative imagery to bring in some sort of emotional reaction in people that hear these. And on one side, on the state side, mostly this rhetoric has been thrown in different metaphors. For example, the river of refugees that is back in full force, or the human tsunami that has been set in motion. Once again, famously employed by the alt-right movements in Italy, but similar rhetoric has also been used by different politicians on the entirety of the political spectrum, which makes it particularly interesting to see how deep into the general imagery and also just acceptability in Italy it has gone. For example, the last quote I have here is from Matteo Renzi, at the time Secretary of the Democratic Party, arguing that we don't have the moral duty to welcome in Italy all the people who are worse off, and that doing so would be an ethical, political, social, and economic disaster. We do have a moral duty to help them and to help them in their homes. So once again, this idea of putting a separation, of doing it like not in my backyard, just a further entrenchment of global inequality in the way we talk about people that are on the move. On the other side, and actually the only side that ever really properly mentions migrants when in all of these discourses, at least that I found, is the kinds of images that are employed by NGOs in response to these security images of invasions. So while both of them sometimes use them, NGOs use universal ideas of humanity and suffering to evoke specific emotions, and the state in particular also uses it to highlight their contribution to search and rescue operations. So there's on NGO side ideas of mothers and children, marks, scars, skin diseases, infected wounds, to highlight the consequences of the policies that happen in the Mediterranean. And then simultaneously, the Italian Coast Guard presents their work in a video that was on the website in 2017, describing themselves as the angels of the sea, the people that are saving lives at sea, even though they don't have any strong search and rescue mandates anymore. So in going to discussion, I'm just going to bring three main themes. The first theme is that of NGO criminalization. So the way in which all of these demonization of NGOs has kept going on has led to several restrictions to the kind of work that they were able to do at sea. So the ways in which these discourses is not just on a theoretical level, but very concretely affects the way in which people are able to do things, to just be seen and also work in the Mediterranean. So the Codice Miniti was an example. The Senate Commission recommendations at the time also for stricter regulations for NGOs at sea, and a clear narrative shift in media outlets between 2016 and 2017. The Angels of the Sea have kind of lost their wings. NGOs are met with a negative veils of suspicion. Their good faith is doubted. The humanitarian mission is debated. This kind of mediatic demonization are at the same time allowed Frontex and the Italian government in particular to obfuscate their role into all of these operations. And lastly, this use of NGOs as a mediatic scapegoat has allowed for the criminalizations of migrants and the EU citizens that were willing to act on solidarity, such as famous case of like Carola Rackete in Italy, or Mimo Lucano is another really famous case. The context of Italy-Libya relations as well, there's double think in the way they talk about Libya and they think of Libya. So at the same time as an unstable country, but also a safe country of return that people can be pushed back to, and the return agreements can be made with, but also just kind of not talking about the invested interests that come in the relations between Italy and Libya that must be kept up. The amount of oil that is exported from Libya to Italy is about 30% of their entire exports. And lastly, the use of international law for their legitimacy. So on the one side, careful craft of images of the sea by governments show a place that is torn apart by criminals and only presents some of the actors that are actually working in that space. The use of the word migrant indistinctively used for refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, victims of trafficking, all in the context of pushbacks and search and rescue, which at the same time restricts the allocation of the label of refugees, but also delegitimizes boat migration in general and underplays non-refoulement violations that are happening in this space. And lastly, lost my train of thought. Lastly, the fact that we keep talking about international waters as a space that is rightless, as a space that has a gap in international law, when in reality, these spaces have overlapping jurisdictions and frameworks of law that allows different actors to kind of selectively choose which parts they decide to discursively abide to and completely ignoring the others. And that is my conclusion. I just brought this over again so that you could see them. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. I was so much echoes with yesterday's presentation of Didier Fassin. It's really wonderful. Maybe you remind me also what that search and rescue organizations and the boats under themselves are laboratories to forge new narratives around migration. And I know that in some boats, we don't call them migrants or refugees or whatever, they call them guests. So they are also a matrix in itself. Okay. All right, so now we are moving to our last presenter, which are very, very happy to receive today, Françoise Lestage, who is an anthropologist and professor at the University of Paris, and also a researcher at the URMIS, the Unité de Recherche, Migration et Société. I'm very glad to have you because you are probably one of the pioneers of working on the issue of migration and death. You started, me 15 years ago, at a time when nobody was talking about migration and death. So very glad to have you today. And we are listening to you. It's a multi-authored presentation, co-authored with Carolina Kobelinsky and Filippo Furri. And we present something about the databases for the dead border crossers, activists and academic uses under scrutiny.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And yes, this paper has been written with Carolina Kobelinsky and Filippo Furri. Carolina and Filippo have done fieldwork together in Catania, and I've done fieldwork with Filippo in the lower French-Italian border. So I explain why. In this conference, we talk a lot about the migrants who died at the borders of the global north, about the policies that produce these deaths, and about the activists or volunteers who try to prevent them or to make them visible. Some of them by developing databases to locate and trace the remains of people who have died during border crossing, and in some cases to set up investigations beyond those carried out by the police in order to identify them. In this presentation, I will talk about two databases we have worked on, Carolina, Filippo, and me. I don't know. In 2018, Carolina and Filippo began to help to set up the one of the database in Catania, Sicilia, that corresponds to a project the local Red Cross began to set up in 2017, at a time when the frequency of dead arrivals at the port of Catania was becoming less intense. As you know, hundreds of dead were found on the Catania beaches, and Carolina and Filippo have already published papers on the treatment of these deaths, often in line with Alejandra's presentation this morning. So in 2000, and I'm not sure I'm very good to manage this thing, the PowerPoint. In 2020, Filippo and I created one database in the French-Italian low border from Ventimiglia to Cannes, where accidents have occurred since 2015, either falls in the mountains, especially at a place called Pas de la Mort, d'Espace, on the road or the train tracks. On the lower French-Italian border, we have so far recorded around 40 migrants who have died accidentally since 2015. 2015, as Nando said, is a shift, and we began the databases in 2015. And in Catania, around 260 bodies have been buried since 2015. In both situations, we observe the emergence of diverse and unexpected forms of relatedness, as Carton said, with the dead, especially among the officials we approached. These connections are not ritualistic, but they promote knowledge and make the dead more visible, as we shall see through several case studies. In this presentation, we would like to raise a set of questions relating to the somewhat less visible and less public dimension of the databases. What does the database do in the everyday lives of the persons involved in building or using it, activists, but mainly undertakers, civil registry employees, police officers, etc.? How does it intervene in the relationship between the living and the dead? In addressing these questions, we propose to explore the ways in which the emotion that emerge upon contact with the database contribute to visibilizing border deaths and to producing new afterlives for the dead by migration. First, I will tell you what sort of information we can find in these databases and how we produce these databases. So the production of both databases. The databases have common fields and specific fields. Some of the fields are the fields which are common in both databases are first names, if known, surnames, if known, It's the same thing, as you know, that in border, US-Mexico border or in other place. Nationality, if known, date of birth, if known, sex, common of burial, date of burial, etc. And each database has also specificities linked to the circumstances of the death and to the research that took place on the spot around the deceased bodies. In Catania, it's about the shipwreck, so search and rescue event, boat, number of survivors, etc. And on the lower French-Italian border, it's about the accident. The known date of the accident, the reference and date of the newspapers that publicize the information, information on the stay in Italy preceding the death, etc. And some informations are only in the Catania database because they require access to information that is in police files, which we have not had access to on the French-Italian border, like size, identity documents, photos, particular signs we don't have in the database of the French-Italian border. And the sources, how these databases were produced. The two databases are the result of two different types of collections. One on written sources, as civil registers, cemeteries, registers, newspapers, and other written sources. And the other one on direct or indirect oral exchanges with persons involved in the management of the bodies, municipal officials, undertakers, forensic doctors, police officers, but also volunteers from organizations such as the Red Cross in Catania. Or, especially in the case of the Italian-French border, with persons who had known the deceased before their death during their stay in Italy, as priests, imams, or activists, mainly. On the French-Italian border, I'm not very good to manage the PowerPoint. Sorry. On the French-Italian border, we brought first information in the newspapers. And we found this sort of information, and then we managed to check it, to check the information with forensic, with the civil registers, with the cemeteries, etc. And the municipal officials were often surprised by our questions and were amazed to learn that we could have a scientific interest in these deaths, which they had not managed differently from any others when they were doing their job. After this initial surprise, most of them offered to help us actively in developing the database. For example, one official from Ventimiglia Town Hall in Italy now monitors new cases and keeps us informed. Or the retired Town Hall Secretary of Saint-Agnès near Menton in France has given us photocopies of the civil register and shown us where the graves are located in the cemetery. So the interest that we as researchers take in these dead people has modified how the civil servants look at the routine administrative operation and maybe their behavior thereafter. In Catania, it was different. In the beginning, at least, we met the employees of the different institutions through the Red Cross. The local committee had formalized institutional exchanges in order to provide systematic access to the documents produced by the various offices. The first agreement was signed in March 2018 with the City Council of Catania, so as to obtain the cooperation and the data of the Civil Registry Office, the Municipal Funeral Service, cemetery, and any other institutions that might have information related to the dead. Next, an agreement was set up with the judicial authorities, which granted the team access to the courts and to law enforcement agencies. At the same time, links were established with associations and other actors involved in the landings. Unlike the officials on the French-Italian border, our interlocutors in Catania did not seem surprised by our interest in the dead border crossers. All of them warmly welcomed the project from the outset and stressed the importance of compensating for the lack of any official investigation aimed at identifying the deceased. Ultimately, the people involved in developing the databases, whether because of us or as a result of their own activism, engaged in some kind of relationship with the deceased migrants once they became aware of the database. But what kind of relationships and what meaning can we give to them? These are the questions we shall now explore more in details. The database, the demand emanated from the researchers or produced in collaboration with them has served as vector, allowing links to emerge and forms of relationship to be forged between those involved in managing the bodies and the deceased migrants at a level other than that of technical management or simply counting the dead. First, the database creates links between the actors, even indirectly by creating the desire to contribute to compiling the data. The technical tool, the database, therefore becomes a means of exchange and collaboration between different official institutions, but also with actors from non-profit organizations. Second, the database inspires new actions. Its development has led some of our interlocutors to reflect on better ways to pay tribute to the unknown dead. For example, talking with us about the migrants buried in the local cemetery, the former secretary of the town hall of Saint Agnès, now a member of the town council, had the idea of putting a plaque near the grave. The grave is anonymous and has no name or date. The former town hall secretary is currently considering putting a plaque on the grave to make the migrant dead visible and to give them an existence in the cemetery like the other dead of the village, because they have plaque on their graves. In Catania, the first identifications made thanks to the database have led to the production of new plaques to be placed in the cemetery, bearing the names of the deceased, when known. And the members of the Red Cross involved in the project are currently considering organizing a ceremony at the cemetery, which would allow both a moment of recollection for the families who are already in contact with the local Red Cross and the visible recognition of the work done by everyone who contributed identifying the dead. Third, the database enhances pre-existing relationships between the actors responsible for managing the body and deceased migrants. For example, the imams of San Remo and Ventimiglia, it's not an imam, but it's someone in charge of the Muslim bodies based in Ventimiglia, who are already dealing with the dead in the Muslim square of San Remo or the local cemetery of Ventimiglia, see in the database a form of recognition of their past work, which serves as an incitement to continue this work with the dead migrants in the future. This is also true of the undertakers, the employees of the municipal funeral home in Catania, who deal with the bodies, but whose job is rarely made visible. The interest we took in them, the time spent on their premises listening to their stories about the dead, the many times the Red Cross team consulted them about a particular body or asked them a question that drew on their memories of an operation following a disembarkation, was seen as a form of recognition of their work and in particular, as one of the employees remarked, of the humanity with which they deal with these disaffiliated dead people. Repeated meetings to gather the information needed to set up the database, especially in 2018 and 2019, also brought up memories of disembarkations where there had been many dead bodies, especially in 2015 and 2016. Sharing these memories, talking about them with us and among colleagues, revived emotions and affects that our interlocutors from the civil registry or the forensic police, to give just two examples, had experienced during the encounter with the dead. In this respect, the database has, in a way, reinvigorated and enriched links with the deceased. Now, what happened with the civil servants? For civil servants, by calling upon these actors, the researchers building the database gives them the legitimacy to express a form of empathy towards the dead and to bring to the surface of their consciousness that which was private and hidden. As Weber pointed out, Max Weber, in capitalist society, compassion and all deep feelings can only be expressed in the private sphere. In other spheres, especially in administration, but also in the economy, these emotions are considered dysfunctional. However, the database has a particular effect on the civil servants, firemen, and undertakers involved with it, who feel concerned by the death and establish post-mortem relationships with the deceased that have an emotional component. It is as if the database made them aware that they belong to the same community. Regarding these communal relationships, Weber gives examples of a religious brotherhood, an erotic relationship, a relation of personal loyalty, a national community, etc. But in the context of our inquiry, we could add the broader example of a community of humans. The actors involved in managing the dead are no longer just police or town hall officials faced with the border dead, but subjectivities affected as a collective group, insofar as they are mostly young people who have died in dramatic circumstances and far from their relatives. Sometimes one of the border dead individually will be difficult, affects them in particular, leading to a form of personalization in the relationship with this singular death. In Catania, some of our interlocutors continue to talk about the fate of two young Somalis whose relationship to one another is unclear, but who died in the Mediterranean and whose post-mortem examinations showed that they were seriously ill. The communal relationships observed at the lower French-Italian border take on much more significant expressions in Catania. Seeing the dead in dreams, talking about them to friends or relatives, and visiting them in the cemetery are all common practices among our interlocutors. Through these practices and discourse, affective ties and relationships of relatedness with the dead are forged, and these lie at the heart of the emergence of a new social inscription of the dead. We have argued elsewhere that these forms of attachment have features that draw them closer to the realm of kinship in a fairly narrow sense of the term, and have named this particular bond a form of kinship by proxy. So, that is the conclusion. The database for civil servants produces a new form of commitment. This is not militant behavior, but rather a paradoxical form of commitment. It's profound insofar as it concerns ontology, the meaning of life, but at the same time, it doesn't call into question either the person's function or his or her convictions. For most of the people we spoke to, this is not a political issue. For example, the municipal civil servant at Ventimiglia Town Hall, who decided to monitor migrant deaths in order to add to our database, took the issue to heart, spoke about it with our colleagues and with our daughter, and found it meaningful both for our work and for our personal life. Now, the news of migrant deaths and the file she has to deal with are processed in two ways. First, through technical management of the file, and second, through our contribution to a tool that transcends her work. In the same vein, Mr. Mancini, who is responsible for the relationships between the undertakers and the cemetery in Catania, told us how these very special days accompanied him in his life outside of work. Li portiamo a casa, we bring them home with us. he summarized, he spoke about them to his family, he visited their graves in the cemetery, he sometimes dreamed about them. And I know the reason why. By getting involved in revising these databases and by wanting to fill in the gaps relating to the identity of the deceased, all our interlocutors give the deceased a multidimensional existence. Technical administrative, they are registered in the database. Local, their existence is mentioned in the cemetery. Religious, they are taken on by the imam and given a space in the Muslim square. Imaginary, they are present in dreams and collective practices that imagine in the course of family conversation or between colleagues, the lives that they might imagine, the lives that they might have had. Moreover, the collaborative dynamics, exchange and dialogue between the actors involved in the management of the bodies becomes a product of the traces left behind by the dead. It's worth noting that, I'm sorry, I passed a part, and this is the conclusion. For the activists and probably for most of the researchers, creating and maintaining this database is a strategy for subverting migratory Negro politics and undoubtedly a way of preventing oblivion and of inscribing these anonymous and lonely dead migrants in a more collective social project. For the state agents involved in managing human remains, the databases which they themselves do not create, but to which they contribute, create resonance with deep feelings of humanity and solidarity towards other human beings. These feelings encourage them to get involved in another way of managing these remains through the databases beyond the strict requirements of their job or role. In return, our interlocutors' commitment gives a place to the dead migrants within the society that has had to take responsibility for their material management. In doing so, it produces new form of existence for the deceased, either on paper, the database itself, or in a cemetery by inscribing their presence on a plaque, in conversations with family and friends, or in dreams. The modes of attachment that emerge in the company of these particular dead people can be thought of as a site of hospitality, post-mortem hospitality.